Sexual morality is one of the biggest aspects of any civilization. How the family and the relationship between man and woman are understood has major effects that ripple through all of society. For over 1,000 years, Western nations lived by Christian sexual morality. Christianity, especially Catholicism, teaches that sexuality is meant for marriage and violating this standard is a sin. Things like pornography, divorce, and homosexuality were treated as bad in the West for most of its recorded history. The supposedly liberal attitudes of the Greeks and Romans are wildly exaggerated. They too believed in strict sexual standards, although slightly different from the Christian morality that would come later. It's really only relatively recently that standards of sexual morality began to wildly change in the West. This became known as the Sexual Revolution. It helped usher in a new regime in the Western world that we still live under today. Unfortunately, this is nowhere more obvious than in the United States. The US is a country that's gone through different eras. When you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, America was a very different country from what it is today. In those days, 95% of the country identified as Christian. Abortion, pornography, contraception, and sodomy were all illegal and morally frowned upon. Divorce and illegitimacy were legal, but rare, and the divorce that was legal wasn't the no-fault kind we have today. The progressive movement of the time period was concerned with strengthening the country's moral values. This was known as being anti-vice. Of course, this is all very different from modern America. In the 2020s, a majority of Americans have developed libertarian attitudes on moral and sexual issues. Many of the vices that were once illegal are now allowed. Casual sex, abortion, and divorce are common. Christianity has declined and been replaced by what can only be called a widespread sense of nihilism. Nihilism being the belief that nothing matters and that morality doesn't exist. Clearly, this modern era is an extreme break from the past of Western nations. Yet in America, even in its current state, people seem to instinctively know that there's something deeply wrong with how things have become. Polls have consistently shown that most Americans are upset with the morality of the country. A majority think morals have gotten much worse, and they rate the morality of America as poor. So when we compare America of the early 1900s and America of the 2020s, the burning question that must be answered is, what happened? There's no one simple answer, but there are certain threads that can be followed. The sexual revolution is one of the biggest things that must be explained. The movement came to its head in the 1950s and 60s. It sought to change America's relatively modest moral values to an unrestricted free-for-all. An America of strong families was turned into a mess. The world we live in today is in many ways a product of this revolution. In this video, we'll be looking at exactly where the sexual revolution came from and how it's had devastating effects for American morality. To truly understand the sexual revolution, we have to understand several key things. First, Christianity, the historic religion of the West, and its relationship to sex. Christian sexual morality has many rules and is not what today would be called liberal. First of all, the Bible contains many passages condemning sexual immorality. For example, sodomy, bestiality, adultery, cross-dressing, and more are all directly condemned in various biblical passages. Jesus said clearly in the book of Matthew that marriage is between one man and one woman for life. The Christian churches developed doctrines that reflected this modest sexual morality. As such, modesty and chastity are Christian virtues while lust and hedonism are sins. Satan is not only a manipulator but a tempter, who offers people short-term pleasure at the expense of their eternal soul. Christianity deepened and fully explained the concept of natural law developed by the ancient Greek philosophers. By this account, sexual morality wasn't a matter of arbitrary or changing value, but of objective truth. Modesty and chastity are virtues because they push man towards the full realization of his nature and finality. In other words, there is a natural order for human sexuality ordained by God, and it is objectively correct for humans to obey it. This is the basis of much of Catholic moral philosophy. All of this is why Christians oppose sexual liberation. With all of that understood, we should next look at the history of the United States and especially the American founding. These things would have major implications in the moral development of America, and eventually, the sexual revolution itself. America began as a British colony. As such, it inherited the Protestant direction that England had been going down since King Henry VIII. England, of course, was a Catholic nation historically, but had broken from the church during the reigns of King Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth I in the 1500s. Therefore, Protestantism was the dominant religion in the young US. However, Catholics were tolerated in certain parts of the country. The religious views of the American Founding Fathers were complicated. Most came from America's Protestant background and believed that religion was critical to American society. Some, like Jefferson and Madison, were more deistic. They picked and chose what parts of God and the Bible they believed in based on what they deemed rational. This was contrasted by founders such as Samuel Adams and John Jay, who was president of the American Bible Society. As I said, the religious views of the founders were diverse and complicated. In any case, the American founding was also heavily influenced by the ideas of the so-called Enlightenment and the philosophy of John Locke. Locke emphasized what he called natural rights granted by God that could be determined through reason alone. He also advocated the indifference of the state toward religion. This was very different from traditional governing philosophy, where the state tended to work with the church towards religious objectives. The founders adopted many of Locke's ideas, and what they created became known as American liberalism. Since the founders were of various Christian denominations and some deists, they wrote religious tolerance into the US Constitution. Some of the founders wanted a vague form of Christianity to be made the official religion of the federal government, but this proposal lost out. The founders were not religiously orthodox, but they were also not hardcore secularists who believed that religion should be banned from public life like modern atheists do. John Adams famously said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other." But despite the founders admiring religion, the Constitution and American liberalism put vague ideas of liberty and equality above all else, even God. American founding ideology also never resolved the conflict between objective morality and natural law versus moral relativism and apathy. All of this opened the door for negative long-term consequences for American morality. American federal judge and author Robert Bork wrote, "The signers of the Declaration of Independence took the moral order they had inherited for granted. It did not occur to them that the document's rhetorical flourishes might one day become dangerous if that moral order weakened." All of this background is very important for future events that would take place in the sexual revolution. America's lack of official religious direction, combined with it being founded on vague notions of liberty, would go on to be exploited heavily for so-called sexual liberation, far beyond the intentions of any of the founders. If they saw the things many people do today, they would tar and feather them, to say the least. For example, colonial America had many different anti-obscenity laws, including laws against buggery, also known as sodomy. At the time of the Revolution and after it, this offense carried severe penalties, and no founding father ever expressed a problem with that. All of this notwithstanding, Christianity remained the dominant religion of the US through the 1700s, 1800s, and early 1900s. Most of this was Protestant denominations, but Catholics did make up an important minority, and their importance would increase as time went on. In fact, by 1900, Catholicism was the largest single church within the United States. By the early 1900s, the United States was a global superpower and one of the wealthiest countries in the world. During this time period, the government still banned things like porn, abortion, sodomy, etc. Devout Christians like Anthony Comstock used their government positions to fight hard against vice and degeneracy. The Comstock laws were a series of laws that banned the transport of obscene material through the mail, and they were strictly enforced. Liberty in America was not seen as liberty to do whatever you wanted, and in fact, it was the mainstream view that to truly protect liberty in society, hedonism had to be restrained. If you watched my video on the French Revolution, you will have heard the difference between positive liberty and negative liberty. Positive liberty is the view that true freedom comes from being allowed to pursue virtue. This is contrasted by the view of negative freedom, which asserts that freedom comes from lack of personal restraints. But despite America's success, there were cracks in the foundation. Freedom of religion meant that Christianity, despite its power, had no official, legal position as part of the federal government. This left openings for anti-Christian actors to enter and subvert the state. At the same time, affluence and decadence had begun to make Americans complacent and materialistic. Already in the 1920s, President Calvin Coolidge warned the country against what he called pagan materialism. Like most educated Americans of his day, President Coolidge believed that Christianity and morality were absolutely vital to American societal health, and he worried that America's rapidly increasing affluence could undermine them. Religion is strongest when life is hard, and is seen by many as an inconvenience when life is easy. People start to believe that material goods are a valid replacement for the divine, and that technology is a valid replacement for God. They're wrong, of course, but this thinking becomes more common with societal affluence. To make matters worse, World War I created a sense of nihilism and sadness that spread across the whole Western world. European civilization and history started to be called into question. To this day, most of the European countries who fought in World War I never regained the power and influence they had prior to the war. Pope Benedict XV referred to World War I as the suicide of civilized Europe. The forces who were hostile to European civilization saw this as their opening to start seizing power. It's no coincidence that after the war, Marxism and modern art grew vastly in popularity. At the same time, America's Protestant elites began to lose their faith and turn their attention to money-making. They also began to adopt early aspects of the sexual revolution. Anglicanism, for example, approved birth control as morally valid in 1930. By the 1950s, most Protestants had become pro-birth control. Many Christian denominations became about being nice or being tolerant rather than any serious moral values. And when your goal is simply to be nice, it's easy to be manipulated and walked all over. Nice and good are not the same thing, and being good often requires a person to not be nice or tolerant. Unfortunately, over the years, this confusion about being nice became a serious problem for Christian America. On top of this, Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe also came to the US and began to promote their own morality, which was often directly at odds with the majority Christian morality. Jewish sources note how they became prominent in Hollywood and the media industry, and this would have a profound impact on America. American Jews tended to be more permissive on all issues relating to sex than the general population. But there was some backlash to the slipping of American standards. American Catholics were one of the last groups fighting for traditional sexual morality, and they stepped up. They created the Hays Motion Picture Production Code, a censorship code that Catholic businessmen forced Hollywood and the film industry to follow. It banned all sexual degeneracy from film, and Hollywood for many years obliged. If Hollywood didn't oblige, Catholics would boycott their films and devastate their profits. On top of banning things like sex and nudity, the code required that no picture shall be produced that will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience should never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. These standards would remain in place for over 30 years and produce some of the best films in American history. But despite these gains, dark clouds were on the horizon. World War II and its aftermath would change everything. In the wake of the rise of fascism and communism, the new field of psychology began to be used for political objectives. It started to paint traditional sexual values as a contributor to what he called authoritarian tendencies. Sexual liberation was proposed as the supposed antidote. The psychologists decided that Western morality would have to be destroyed and replaced in order for fascism to never rise again. Many of these psychologists were directly funded by American intelligence agencies like the CIA, who found their ideas useful in de-radicalizing political opposition to American liberalism. To quote the 2002 British documentary Century of the Self, those in power used Freud's theories to try to control the dangerous crowd in the age of mass democracy. Psychology ceased being about trying to understand the human mind and became about controlling it. The decadence and materialism that had already been developing in America was vulnerable to this exploitation. The sexual revolution had begun. The invention and spread of the home television would prove decisive in changing the morality of America. In 1950, only around 15% of American households had a television, but by 1960, that figure had risen to 85%. As the years went by, houses bought multiple TVs which kids could use without their parents' supervision. Almost every TV channel during this time was controlled by one of three networks: ABC, NBC, and CBS. These networks were heavily tied to US intelligence agencies who used them to push their ideological agenda. This was known as Operation Mockingbird, and today, far from being a conspiracy theory, it's a matter of public record. When the Cultural Revolution began in the 1960s, news stations gave the protesters overwhelmingly positive coverage. Meanwhile, those who defended American culture and Western traditions were painted as the villains. A new pop culture based on the latest shows, movies, and music began to develop in America, replacing much of its ancient European culture that had been passed down for generations. This resulted in deracination, or, in other words, the loss of people's roots. The cultures of Hollywood and Washington, D.C. were exported to the entire United States, and regional cultures started to decline. Despite the motion picture production code still being in effect, the TV and film industry began to push the boundaries of sexual morality. The capitalistic pursuit of profit and the liberal pursuit of sexual hedonism ended up being a match made in heaven, or should we say, hell. By the mid-1960s, the production code was broken so often that it was abandoned entirely. The floodgates were now open for total media degeneracy, and companies happily obliged. Sex, drugs, abortion, homosexuality, and more all flooded American culture. Both high-level institutions and youth movements were the backbone of the new sexual culture. Elite universities began broadcasting pornography to their students and encouraged them to attend. Liberal and Marxist professors saw the 60s as their opportunity to finally destroy the long-held Christian values of the West, that they had always opposed but they could now paint as authoritarian and fascist. But where the sexual revolution truly found success was in the judicial system. With American society being rapidly morally transformed from the top down, judges began to do their part. In the 1947 case Everson v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court commanded states that they could not grant religious privileges to anyone. Prior to that point, states didn't have to abide by freedom of religion as outlined in the federal Constitution, and they often gave Christians preferential treatment. So really, separation of church and state as we know today is less than 80 years old. This decision set the stage for a new form of secularism so severe that it would be fair to call it anti-religious. The Supreme Court then took direct aim at America's morality. Anti-pornography laws were the first thing to be gutted. Roth v. United States in 1957 and Miller v. California rendered all anti-pornography laws effectively moot. Birth control was the next thing to be legalized nationwide in 1965 with Griswold v. Connecticut. Author E. Michael Jones explains why contraception is so significant. It's the thin end of the wedge that disconnects sex from its natural purpose of reproduction, and once sex loses its original purpose, moral chaos isn't far behind.
If you want my honest opinion, the Cultural Revolution was the legalization of contraception. The sexual revolution followed from that, abortion followed from that, and homosexual rights is only the logical consequence of the use of the contraceptive.
And he was absolutely proven right. After the legalization of contraception in the 1960s, abortion followed with Roe v. Wade in the 1970s. Each new aspect of sexual behavior that was legalized flowed from the exact same anti-Christian, hyper-individualist moral philosophy that personal pleasure is the highest value of life. This has continued into modern America with things like the LGBT movement and transgenderism. The slippery slope was real, because the same arguments for legalizing porn can be copy-pasted to all other sexual issues. Over the years, the American left became increasingly anti-Soviet and fully embraced individualistic arguments about personal freedom. This encyclopedia entry defines the new left as a mix of Marxism and libertarianism that focused on gender, race, and sexuality issues rather than class like the old left. From a philosophical standpoint, the sexual revolution justified itself through the ideas of people like John Stuart Mill. Mill wrote in his 1859 book On Liberty, "Liberty consists in doing what one desires." No other line better encapsulates the sexual revolution than this. Mill advocated a form of radical individualism that created an adversarial relationship between the individual and society. One could of course criticize this ideology by saying that society-wide ills affect all individuals in one way or another, but I digress. But Mill's ideas were far from the only philosophy that drove the sexual revolution. A variety of psychologists, writers, and scientists all pushed it forward. I'll go through some of the most important ones. First, we have Alfred Kinsey. Originally an insect zoologist, he was paid by the CIA-backed Rockefeller Foundation to change his research to humans. He authored such works such as Sexual Behavior of the Human Male. The book claimed that sexuality was a spectrum, and people should be able to identify as whatever they want. He also created the Kinsey Scale, which asserted that people do not fit into binary sexual categories. Then there was John Money. He performed transgender experiments to try to prove gender was socially constructed. This involved forcing a young boy to live as a girl and having him perform sexual acts on his own twin brother. Both twins had lifelong trauma from the experiment and would later commit suicide. I wish I was making this up, but no, it really happened. The names of the victims in Money's experiments were Brian and David Reimer. Today, the case has finally attracted the infamy and criticism that it rightly deserves. Theodor Adorno of the Frankfurt School was another key intellectual who pushed the revolution forward. He authored The Authoritarian Personality, a bestseller that declared all people with traditional sexual values were potential fascists. The purpose of the book was to attempt to pathologize people who preferred normal sexual views and family life. The male-led family model itself was identified as something that creates fascism, and a new genderless family model would have to take its place to protect democracy. Yes, that is really what the book says. Then there was Michel Foucault. He was a French homosexual and pro-pedophilia writer. He petitioned France to abolish its age of consent laws and demanded that children be given the individual freedom to consent to sex with adults. His writings were a major influence on the European branch of the sexual revolution. Now, of course, freedom was the excuse and justification that most public figures used to make their arguments for sexual liberation, but a more realistic look at their philosophy and behavior could see them as simply perverts looking for any excuse to normalize their behavior to the world. Now, many people listening to this are probably wondering, where was the right-wing response to all of this? Unfortunately, the right-wing response to the sexual revolution was extremely weak. Since World War II, conservatives largely adopted liberal notions of individual liberty and anti-authoritarianism. Because of the Cold War and battle with communism, they also ignored how capitalistic companies were directly using sexual degeneracy for profit. Their arguments against communist authoritarianism undermined their own ability to regulate culture in the US. To put it simply, many so-called conservatives were more concerned with conserving their money than traditional values. Even today, American conservatives still suffer from this same problem, and many have simply given up on governing at all and have adopted libertarianism.
I think that at the heart of my philosophy is much more libertarianism. The conservative, so-called, is the one that says, less government, get off my back, get out of my pocket, and let me have more control of my own destiny.
So, where does this all leave us in the year 2023? As I said at the beginning of the video, we are still living under the regime of the sexual revolution. When we look at the fruits of what it brought our society, it's hard to call it anything other than a complete catastrophe. Let's begin by looking at the state of the American family. Illegitimacy rates were less than 10% in 1960. In the 2010s, they rose to above 40%. Illegitimacy, of course, has many negative outcomes, such as increasing crime and lowering educational attainment. Family formation has become very hard in modern America, and divorce is common. The decline of the family structure has led to youth mental illness, suicide, and drug abuse to reach their highest level ever recorded. Male suicide in particular increased because the male role in society is now unclear. Because of the sexual revolution, men went from being the leaders of Western civilization to cogs in a genderless machine. Not that women are doing much better. Female antidepressant use and victimhood of rape are much higher today than they were in the patriarchal model of society. Feminism and free love have led to more rapes and crimes against women than patriarchy ever could have dreamed of. There's an irony to that. But it gets even worse. Crime and child abuse exploded in the 1960s and remain high today. There have been over 60 million abortions since Roe v. Wade, around 20% of the entire US population. You'd think that birth rates would be up with this so-called sexual freedom, but it's the opposite. They've plummeted. The Chinese political scientist Wang Huning observed about America, "The individual has replaced the family as the cell of society. In spirit, the family is being hollowed out. Fragmentation of the family has deprived society of many human feelings, which is also detrimental to a harmonious society." The only people who benefited from the sexual revolution are those who hated the family, hated Christianity, and wanted a mindless society of atomized individuals with no moral standards. After all, such a society is much easier to control and corrupt than a virtuous and dutiful one. The morals that are enforced today are mainly codes against racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, etc. It's important to understand that these accusations aren't actually part of any moral code, but are mostly just used to shut down rational discussion and assert power over others. The inherent flaws of America's founding liberalism never went away. Like a house whose foundation is stable until it erodes, the cracks in liberalism were paved over by America's very intelligent, religious, and hard-working European population. But once these things declined, the flaws of liberalism exploded into view. Now, it would be wrong to say that America hasn't improved in any ways since the 1960s. It obviously has. But on many metrics, on key issues that affect every citizen, America has declined. The question we face today is, can we learn from the mistakes of the past? The first step to fixing a mistake is admitting you made one. On the positive side, there are some good indications in modern America. As I said before, most Americans say in polls that they're very dissatisfied with the state of the country. People know deep down that things need to change. The internet and modern technology have provided the means to understand and address the horrifying damage the sexual revolution has done to society. Those who claim that the sexual revolution's morality is permanent are wrong. Even Roe v. Wade fell after 50 years, despite many naysayers saying for years that abortion would be legal forever. The will to change the world still matters. Ultimately, the sexual revolution cannot last forever, because it is fundamentally against the laws of nature and God. We have hindsight that people in the past didn't have. We can learn from all of the mistakes of the sexual revolution. Undoing its damage and getting ourselves back on the path of natural law will be the task of our generation. This has been Pax, and thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos, please consider supporting the channel. Also, leave a comment letting me know your thoughts on everything. As always, I will see you in the next video.